Morning, we're going to start a new series on Peter. 1Peter, we're going to start with 1Peter and probably go through 2Peter as well. And make sure everything's going good. Yep. No, we're not going to do a class necessarily. The Bible class will be something different. Yeah, this will just be this one. And I'll tell you what, AI image generation has gotten better in some respects. The picture behind you is generated by AI, but it can't spell blessings. We tried to create some logos and things for little blessings. It could not figure out. Even though I had it in there, I said create a picture with, quote, this right here, unquote, and it couldn't figure it out. So it's just, yeah. It's pretty funny.
Well, can you at least see the picture you want and then just kind of overlay
I have to do a little Photoshop because some people have 6 fingers. But yeah, hands are just beyond it for some reason. Although this hand turned out really well. The prompt I used for this one was Peter from the Bible holding the key to heaven or something like that. Anyway, with in the type of in a Baroque style painting. Anyway, so that's how this one came up. Anyway, let's get started. So last week we talked about Christianity being weird, and Peter's going to talk about that here as well. Weird or different, either way, but different can be weird and different can be dangerous, is my point. And today we're going to start a series studying through 1st and 2nd Peter, and probably Jude as well. This was a circular letter. It was designed to be sent to multiple church communities, right? He even tells us right there in the first few verses who it's to. And Peter's trying to encourage and offer pastoral support. He's trying to shepherd them, these communities. And these communities are communities of suffering Christians. Most likely this is not suffering at the emperor level yet, although it could have been. I'll get to that a little bit later. But we need to remember that a faithful church will suffer. If we listen to Paul and if we listen to Jesus, they both say a faithful church will suffer. But still, these were communities that he likely had never met or had only met for a little while. And so we discover at the end of this letter, at the conclusion of this letter, that Peter is in what he calls Babylon when he's writing this letter. The most likely place for Babylon is not in Persia, but this is most likely Rome. Does anybody remember what Peter's original name was, though? Simon. Simon was his original name. Yeah. Simon or Simeon or Shimon. Simeon we might recognize from being the who? The second son of Jacob, right? Second son of Israel. His name was Simeon. It's the same name here, Simon. And then Jesus, well, let me back up. Peter was chosen to be part of Jesus' inner circle of 12 disciples. And when he made this confession that Jesus was the Messiah, Jesus changed his name to what? Wrong. Cephas. He changed it to Cephas, which is Aramaic for rock, which then gets translated into Greek as Petros, and then it doesn't get translated into English, it gets transliterated. They just use a lot of the same sounds and letters as Peter. And so Jesus changes Shimon's name to Cephas, and it's then transliterated into English as Peter. So Jesus promises that Peter would become a leader among the apostles And he would guide this new messianic community in Jerusalem. He would guide that community through its earliest years. And that's exactly what happened, if we remember the first half of the book of Acts. And as the story continues through the book of Acts, we get to chapter 10. What is famous about chapter 10? Anybody remember off the top of their head? What happens in chapter 10? Context clues here is with Peter. Huh? Acts. Context clues here with Peter. Some major events happening. Yes.
When they unclean animals come
Yes.
down, and then
Peter's vision, and then Cornelius, and those sort of things happen there.
the first Gentile conversion.
Yep, the first Gentile conversions. We see Peter bringing the gospel to the Gentiles, right? And so Peter was called to carry the good news of Jesus now beyond the borders of Israel. And this letter that we have here was written probably decades into that mission in the wider Gentile world. This was a circular letter, like it was designed to be passed around, right? We talked about that. And this is to communities that are in the Roman province of Asia Minor, which is, of course, modern-day Turkey. And Peter learned that these mostly non-Jewish Christians were being persecuted. And they were facing hostility and harassment. Because their Greek and Roman neighbors saw that they didn't believe in the same gods as they did. And so Peter wrote to encourage them in the midst of this suffering that they're going through, right? And that sort of helps to explain the letter's design and its main purpose. We're going to go through that again. But let's look a little closer at the location now. Hopefully, oh, good, it shows up. Good behind me. Let's read 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 1. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who reside as exiles, chosen exiles. God's chosen exiles. We're going to come back to that in a little bit and get deeper into that. But God's chosen exiles who are in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. That is, these are Christians living in the northern part of Asia Minor that bordered the Black Sea. Right? Think of this as modern-day Turkey, the northern part of modern-day Turkey. Does anybody remember from Acts chapter 16 something that happened with Paul in this area? Acts chapter 16. Paul was what? The man from Macedonia calls him over to Macedonia, but where was Paul trying to go to?
Is this when he goes to the Areopagus?
No. Paul was trying to go to Bithynia, but he was stopped on his way by this vision and told not to go to the northern part of Turkey. This very place that Peter's writing all these letters to, Paul was told not to go there, and so he heads west through Colossae and Ephesus, where we get those letters from, right? Because later on he's writing them back to the churches he had visited on that trip. So Paul goes south instead. And so we don't know who first preached the gospel in the north, actually. We don't know when it happened or who did it. Some of these places are actually mentioned in Acts chapter 2 and verse 9 when Peter is preaching on the day of Pentecost. There's people there from these regions, so maybe that was a clue. But we don't have any physical record of Peter ever having traveled in that area. It is possible, though, it's very possible that Peter himself went there, though, sometime after AD 50. That would be Acts chapter 15, the last reference to him being in Jerusalem. So between AD 50 and AD 64, which is traditionally when the church says that he died in Rome during what happened to AD 64 in Rome? Anybody remember last week? I mentioned it. What happened to the Jews?
I'm thinking 80, 70 where they get
That's the temple. Yep. So before that, in AD 64, under the reign of Claudius and then Nero after that, the Jews were expelled from Rome. Well, they were expelled before that as well. But so Peter goes to Rome, and then that's the traditional date of that many churches believe that he died. It's not in the Bible. Let me just tell you that. So what's interesting though about these provinces is that if Peter traveled to Syria, which is over on the right-hand side off of the map here, and he went north and hit the Black Sea and then went west on his way to Rome, he would have had to have traveled through this area. He mentions going to Syria as well in Acts. So it's a possibility that's the route he took. And what's interesting also is that if you start on the northeast shore, up in the top right of this picture, and you take the road, the only road there's that major road through that area, you land and you follow a route. This road follows a route along the northern coastline that goes in the same order that Peter is writing these things. So there's a chance that maybe he sent a messenger or maybe he himself went on that route. Anyway, it's just kind of an interesting side note. Another side note is that this is the backwater. This is the backwoods of the Roman Empire. This is where all the hicks are. When the Christians got kicked and the Jews got kicked out of Rome, many of them went to Asia to go and live because it was still profitable. There was still trading going on, those sorts of things. And so there were large Jewish communities in the Roman Empire, but they were considered the backwater. Those were not developed areas until much later. They didn't have a ton of statues and sort of things to Caesar until we get to later on in the 70 AD time period. So let's get into 1 Peter now. 1 Peter, I'm going to say it has four main parts. There's a lot of different ways you could break down 1 Peter. 1 Peter has 5 chapters, but sort of four main parts. Chapter 1 begins with this greeting, and then it moves into sort of a song, the song of praise, of poetic praise to God. And this song is going to introduce these key themes to us that are going to be explored then throughout the rest of the body of this letter. And that's chapter 1. The end of chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2, Peter first is going to focus his letter on affirming this new identity in Jesus. And he's going to tell them that persecution is evidence of how putting your loyalty in Jesus can be seen as threatening to others. Remember last week? Weird can be dangerous. Different can be dangerous. In the second half of chapter 4 through chapter 3, the second half of chapter 2 through chapter 3 and into the beginning of chapter 4, Peter is going to begin to explore their suffering. He says they're going to be newborn babes, but they are then supposed to grow up into these living stones that are strong, that can stand against the suffering, that can bear witness of Jesus to the world. And once they see their suffering as beneficial to the world around them, That's a difficult thought, right? It's easy to point to Jesus and see his suffering as beneficial to us, right? It's much more difficult for me to go out and say, I'm going to go suffer because it's beneficial to the rest of this world. Right? That's not the American way. It's not I go out and suffer. What's the famous Patton quote that I won't quote exactly because it's profane? The object of war is not to suffer and die for your own country. It's to make the other guy suffer and die for his country. That's how the American thought goes, right? But Peter tells these people that once they see the suffering, their own suffering, as beneficial to the world around them, they can begin to focus in on the future hope that they have of the return of Jesus, that then is going to be described in chapters 4 through 5. And so Peter knows his audience. He knows in general, especially that they're Gentiles mostly. And he does this masterful job of applying the sayings of both Jesus and the Old Testament. It's funny, 1 Peter is one of the most densely packed of all the books that we have in the New Testament, densely packed with Old Testament quotes and allusions. Some people count as many as 40 different allusions just in the 5 chapters here. That's like one every 2 verses. So that's a lot. I would say there's probably closer to 20, because those are the more obvious ones. But Peter is doing this masterful job of applying the sayings of Jesus and the Hebrew Scriptures to his own contemporary problems. And so 1 Peter then is a model for us today in the church, how we can use those same materials, the words of Jesus and the sayings of the Hebrew Scriptures. And we can see how they will apply to us. Some people, some commentators even see this letter as what might have been taught through or at a baptism. Baptism is going to be mentioned here in 1 Peter chapter 3 when we talk about godly living and living stones and those sorts of things. Because it's at baptism that we become a new creature. Man, that sounds familiar. It sounds a lot like Bible class. Being renewed in the Spirit by the washing of the regeneration. That Ezekiel language that's talking about breathing new life into the bones, the dry bones. At baptism, we become a new creature with a new way of life that is a renunciation. It's a refutation of the old life, of our old life. And in this new life, there is a new loyalty. There is a new allegiance, along with new worship. And that leads us to live and fulfill duties that seem weird socially. Right? Christianity is weird. It's weird to the world around us that doesn't recognize those sorts of things. Let's look at verses 1 and 2 again. Let's start off with Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ. So depending on what source you use, well, I already mentioned that, sorry. So I talked about the Old Testament allusions. Let's talk about a few of those right now. Let's just look at verses 1 through 2 for the rest of this lesson this morning, so we can see how Peter uses these allusions to show this new born-again life and hope that the readers have in Jesus, the Messiah. By using the language of the Hebrew Scriptures and applying that language to the Gentiles, Peter can appeal. He can reach out to both the Jews and the Gentiles who are in the church at the same time, even though his primary audience is probably mainly Gentiles. So Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ. Peter is going to identify himself here as an apostle of Jesus Christ. That is, he's a messenger. An apostle is one who is sent. A messenger of Jesus, who is sent out into the world with the authority to carry the will of the one who sent him. That's what an apostle is. And this letter, he wants us to see this letter not as the opinions of a friend who wants to wish us well. Peter wants us to see these words as the authoritative word of one who speaks for Yahweh, for the Lord, and to the church. This is the Lord speaking to the church himself through Peter. That's how he wants us to see that. So Peter is an apostle to those who are elect exiles. And this is where we get our first overt reference to the Old Testament. Because Peter addresses his letter, he's in the address line, he's writing to those who are exiles, to those who are sojourners, to those who are foreigners. There's a lot of different translations of this word. Exiles of the what? Of the diaspora, of the dispersion, a lot of versions say. That Greek word diaspora forces us to reflect on and think about the conquests of the Assyrian and the Babylonian empires over Israel and Judah. Right? Because the result of that exile saw thousands upon thousands of Jews scattered all over the Mediterranean world and beyond, into Africa and into the Far East. And so Jews had used this term diaspora or dispersion to talk about their communities that were scattered outside of the land of Palestine there, ever since there have been Greek versions of the Hebrew Scriptures. If we look at the LXX, the Septuagint, the earliest versions of the Septuagint that we have are 250 years older than the oldest Hebrew text that we have. Did you know that? They're much older. And so we see this word diaspora popping up in these Greek translations of the Hebrew Scriptures in Deuteronomy 28, especially in Nehemiah and Isaiah. And it occurs several times in the New Testament, this word diaspora. And it has the same meaning, too, in John chapter 7 and verse 35. And John 11, 32. It means those people who are dispersed, God's people who are dispersed. And so at the same time, at the time of Peter, there were maybe 1 million Jews living in Palestine, the land of Palestine. But there were 2 to 4 million Jews who lived outside of the land of Palestine. And that was a significant number in the Roman Empire. And so let's not forget that the Jews, and therefore the Christians, that were the significant population, would then begin to attract attention. And what happens when we have Nero and Claudius is they become exiled from Rome. They're blamed for certain problems. Under Nero, they were blamed for fires. And where were they exiled to? Well, many went to these backwater provinces in Asia, because that's as far away from Rome as you could get and still be within the Roman Empire. And so they were spread in these communities all over the empire, but they belonged to Palestine and eventually sort of hoped to return there. Maybe when the Messiah came, they could return. And so in Peter, in his letter here, we find this natural transfer of the titles of Israel to his primary audience, which is Gentiles, to the church. And we frequently see that used throughout the letter, especially in chapter 2. It's done at least 2 or 3 times directly. 1 Peter 2 in verse 5 and also in verse 9, where he says that they're a spiritual house, a royal priesthood. Those language from the Hebrew scriptures he's now putting onto the church. And so the church then consists of these communities of people living outside of their native land, which is not Jerusalem or Palestine, because these are, how long ago was the Babylonian captivity before Jesus comes along? 500 years, 700 years at least. And so these are not like my homeland I left, when I was 12. These are like my homeland that I left 15 generations ago type of deal. And so their homeland is not Jerusalem or Palestine. Now that they're members of the church, their homeland is this new Jerusalem, this heavenly city. These people owe their loyalty to this city now, rather than the city, Rome, right? And their life on this earth is temporary, and they don't belong here, and so they call themselves sojourners, right? It's also found in Hebrews chapter 11. They're pilgrims, they're foreigners, they're exiles. It's the same word, exiles. Those who belong to the new Jerusalem, the heavenly city. Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 19, and Philippians 3 and verse 20. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who are elect exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, in the sanctification of the Spirit, for obedience to Jesus Christ, and for the sprinkling with his blood, may grace and peace be multiplied to you. I want to talk the rest of this morning about these two verses and what they mean or can mean for us. And I want to use another metaphor. I want to use another example. And this time, I'm going to extend it out into next week as well. So think about this next week. And the metaphor is this. I want us to imagine that Peter is describing the layout of a building. And in these three opening paragraphs here, verses 1 through 8 or 9 here, in these first few paragraphs, Peter is going to set out this building for us, the width, its height, and the depth or the breadth of this building. And everything that follows from this letter is going to be one of those sort of three or four things. So to begin with, let's look at the width of this building. How wide is this building? And this is what Christians are. We are chosen. We are set aside. We are sanctified for obedience. We're sprinkled with the blood of the Messiah. And Peter doesn't address these people in terms of their ancestry. That's not how wide the building is. He doesn't address them in terms of their moral background. Oh, you've done this, so you're not included, right? He doesn't address them in terms of their social status. Oh, you don't make enough money. He doesn't address them in terms of their wealth or their poverty. All those things are part of the old building. This building that he's drawing for us, that he's sketching out for us, is a new building. And sometimes it's easy for us to forget our basic identity as Christians. And so it's very important. Therefore, it's very important to be reminded of our identity on a regular basis. If we are wise, if we regularly take our car in to be serviced, so that anything that's starting to go wrong with it can be made right, If we're wise, we'll do those things. And in the same way, we need to remind ourselves frequently, seriously, and thoroughly who we really are. And unless we do that, we will hear these insidious little messages from the world around us. That we are who we are because of who our parents are. That we are who we are because of where we live, because of our job, because of how much we earn. And that will eat away at us like rust on a car. So who are we is the question that I want to try and answer this morning, or that Peter answers here for us. And what is the basic dimensions of this room that Peter's trying to invite us into? This is similar to our metaphor from Bible class about the party. We've been invited to this party. This lavish invitation has been extended to us, even though we don't deserve it. Now, how big is the room that this party is being held in? We are people who, by the mercy of God, have been chosen to participate. We've been chosen for a particular purpose. I think all Christians live a sort of strange double life. And Peter talks about this. He calls us foreigners because they now have dual citizenship, right? They are at the same time, they are simultaneously inhabitants of this actual country, district, whether it's Bithynia or Asia or Cappadocia or Galatia or Pontus. They are residents of that actual district, but they're also citizens of God's new world. As he's going to say here really quickly, he's going to say that's waiting to be unveiled. And this is God's purpose, to set aside us, to set us aside from other uses so that we can be signposts for all of humanity to see. Remember at the beginning of this lesson, I was talking about how suffering can be beneficial to others, and that's what God wants us to be. Us being a signpost to the world involves us reflecting who God is into the world for all of humanity to see, so that they can know the way into this new reality, to this massive feast that God has, this new world. This new world that in fact has already come through the life of Jesus, that is coming into effect now through the church, that the church is bringing the kingdom of God into this world through the resurrection of Jesus and the power that he gives us. And it's through that sacrificial death on the one hand, and the indwelling of God's Spirit in the other hand at their baptism. It's through those things that God has set us, the people, apart so that we can be signals, not just signposts, but flashing lights to the world so that they can see this new world that's coming. And so these people are supposed to be holy, both in the technical sense, sort of, and that God has set them apart for a purpose, and they're supposed to be holy in the sense, in a practical sense, that their actual lives have been transformed. And the way they behave now needs to reflect God's desire for us, his human creatures. And that, however daunting that task seems, is who we are as Christians. That's how wide the building is. It says, wide as this world. That's how big the invitation is to come into this building. Next week, this is another AI-generated picture. So if you see, there might be some funny things like buildings on a boat. Next week, we'll look at the vertical dimension of this room and how Peter talks about God and what he's done God and what he's done. And Peter praises him, not simply just describing these things, but praises God for them. And we're going to look also next week, probably, maybe the week after, at the depth of this room, or the length of this room, because quite a bit of this letter here of 1 Peter is on the topic of the suffering of these early Christians. And Peter here is going to lay out the concepts that he's going to develop later in the book. And that is, like I've said it 3 times already now, that this suffering that they're enduring is the means by which the quality of the Christian's faith, of our faith, it's the way that our faith can shine out even more. And when Jesus is finally revealed, that suffering is going to result in an explosion of praise. And so as we begin to walk into this room and look around us, there's a lot to see. There's difficult things to see. Difficult things that have to be faced. But with this new identity that we have, with the powerful mercy of God keeping us safe, the power of His Spirit indwelling us, we can go ahead and make the room, or this letter, and its meaning for our lives. We can make that a place where we feel thoroughly at home, where our identity is in Jesus, and that is comforting. This morning, if you haven't placed your allegiance, if you haven't placed your loyalty in Jesus the Messiah, you need to. It's a lifelong commitment. But it starts with a declaration of your allegiance and loyalty in faith to Jesus. If you haven't done that, we can help you with that this morning. We can fill up this tub right behind me. We can put to death the old man, figuratively. I won't hold you down too long. And you can come up a new person alive in the Holy Spirit. If you need that, or you need the prayers of the congregation, please let us know, and we will arrange for those things. It's good to have everybody here this morning. We'll see you all next week. All right, let's grab our songbook. And let's all stand.